Why do we think autistic people are a problem? Why do we think black people are a problem? Why do we think Muslims are a problem? We think they're a problem because of the way our society is set up. It's very interesting where the focus and where the spotlight on who the people who are a problem are. And this is very much in the frame of eugenic thinking. Because eugenic thinking was Francis Galton essentially rebranding race science for the 20th century. So it's bigger than we think it is, but also it never went away.
Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam François. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. Today, I want to discuss eugenics, the belief that you can improve the human race by manipulating genetics. For most people, it's a debunked theory rooted in racist ideas that led to some of humanity's darkest chapters: human zoos, the Holocaust, forced sterilization. But, newsflash, it's creeping back. In the US, over 20% of non-black adults explicitly agree with genetic hierarchies used to justify prejudice, claims like women are hysterical, black people are less intelligent, or that the disabled are worthless. More worryingly still, these ideas are now propagated by those in power. Trump has described immigrants as having bad genes. OpenAI's Sam Altman invests millions in embryo screening as Silicon Valley revels in the idea of designer babies. Elon Musk has 14 kids and counting, reportedly because he believes his genes are among the world's fittest, and to address what he calls an underpopulation crisis. Today's far right knows it's wrong to talk openly about a superior race, so they reframe it as a superior culture. A subtle shift, but with similar outcomes. Here in the UK, Reform leader Nigel Farage leads the charge, linking immigrants and Muslims to crime and pushing policies on these ideas. Across Europe, fears of white people being threatened by dangerous hordes have resurged, spoken more openly than ever. To unpack how these dangerous beliefs persist, distort science, and lead to violence, I'm joined by Subhadra, historian of science, author, and former curator of Francis Galton's papers. Yes, that Francis, founder of Eugenics. In her acclaimed book, Uncivilized: 10 Lies That Made the West, she reveals how these ideas quietly live on and continue shaping almost every part of the world around us. Subhadra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. You've spent decades researching ideas around scientific racism and eugenics. For those who are not familiar with it, what exactly is eugenics? And wasn't it debunked?
Eugenics is what I would call a disproved science. Most people, if they hear about it, they might hear the word pseudoscience associated with it, as in a way of thinking that appropriates the language and the ideology of science. Eugenics was not that. Eugenics was very much a science. It was done by scientists. It was carried out in scientific ways. It was very much part of the mainstream. If we were to travel back in time 100 years, eugenics is very much appropriate science of the time period. Was it debunked? Yes, it has been categorically disproved. Unfortunately, eugenics slipped the bounds of science a very long time ago.
Okay, so it slips the bounds of science. I guess the difficult thing for me to, and I think probably a lot of people to get our head around, is this idea that we're raised on this idea that science is truth with a capital T, right? Mm-hmm. It's the reliable, immutable, objective, neutral knowledge. Mm-hmm. So how can it be simultaneously science, as in it was the dominant understanding in science of the day, but mm-hmm. also not science?
Well, the thing about science is, and any good scientist will tell you this, is that it really should be based in uncertainty rather than certainty. And the reason why we are able to comprehensively say eugenics will not work is because of the work of many brilliant geneticists through the course of the 20th century who, through exploring how genes work and how that particular aspect of our biology and the heritability of traits works, they can categorically say this is an impossible thing to control. This is the ways in which Francis Galton, who comes up with the name for the thing in the 1880s, but then also lots of other scientists who are his colleagues and who exist in his milieu, and then a generation then who go on to carrying it on in the early 20th century, the thing they wanted to do is not scientifically possible. However, that doesn't mean that it wasn't science back in the day. And I think this idea that science is an objective and neutral truth, capital T, is something that we need to be very wary of. Now, am I anti-science? Absolutely not. There is so much hideous damage that is being done to our populations in terms of the anti-vax movement, but also to our planet in terms of climate crisis denial, that now is not the time to turn away from science. But what we do need to understand is that many of the inequalities and injustices that exist in our societies come originally from scientific ideas. And so therefore, the onus is on us who are not scientists to be more robust in how we understand it. And the onus is on those scientists to make their science more accessible so that we can all understand it properly.
And where did your personal interest in eugenics come from?
It was an occupational hazard. I ended up being curator of a thing called the Galton Collection at University College London. And
which is one of the UK's top universities, right?
Indeed. I knew who Francis Galton was. I knew that he had propounded the term eugenics. I knew that he was an important figure in the history of science in terms of a lot of other science. So meteorology, psychology, sociology, genetics, statistics as well. You know, it's like I knew that he was associated with all of these things. Until I started doing that job, I didn't have a proper appreciation for what it actually meant and for what the fact that eugenics really is this idea that was way bigger than we thought it was. It's not just the Nazis, and also that it never went away.
So tell us more about both of those things. So it's bigger than the Nazis and it never went away.
Yeah. So if people have heard of the idea of eugenics, and my experience as someone who is a history of science communicator who specializes in the history of eugenics, most people have not. But if they have heard of it, what they probably know is the Nazis. And therefore they think that it was something that only the Nazis did and that it stopped in 1945. And by no means do we mean to diminish the horrors of the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jewish people. Important to point out that it wasn't only Jewish people who were systematically murdered. The Nazis started with disabled people. This is how they built their experiment in Action T4. And also that they went about systematically killing black people in Europe, Polish people, Roma people, homosexuals, even people who disagreed with them politically. So, yeah, the Nazis' eugenics regime is often actually much bigger than people conceive of it. But the one thing that Nazis who were tried at Nuremberg said as their defense was, we are not alone. And what they are pointing to is practices in the United States, which was the sterilization without their consent. The numbers do vary, but it's something in the region between 60 and 90,000 people in the US over the course of the 20th century, post the Second World War. But both pre and post the Second World War were sterilized without their consent because they were deemed feeble-minded. So this is a case that came before the Supreme Court, and the decision came out in 1927 called Buck versus Bell, where Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and I'm about to use a slur in a historic context, apologies, said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this is when the Supreme Court of the US decided that it is constitutional to sterilize people without their consent if they're deemed to not be intelligent enough to make that decision for themselves.
Can the American government still sterilize people today?
That law's still on the books.
Yeah. So the American government today is still sterilizing people on the basis that some people are unfit to reproduce?
As far as I'm aware, these particular policies are not enacted in the same way as they had been historically. And in point of fact, credit to many families who, there are people who were sterilized when they were teenagers in the 1960s and 70s who have brought cases against the US. For what happened to them. It's a bit more subtle in terms of how they do it. So, for example, contraception is one of the conditions of bail in some US states I think I'm right in saying California is one of them. So there are people who go through the criminal justice system, and if they want to go on parole or if they want to be relinquished from that system, sometimes the condition is that they have to demonstrate that they are on birth control. So there's still this idea that the US government wants to control the reproduction of its population. It just does it more subtly than it used to.
Wow. Okay. So I'll tell you where this topic came back on my radar. So I obviously saw, as many of us did, that Sydney Sweeney advert, which was online being debated as heavily coded, right? Heavily coded with the whole like race, these are good genes. But hey, I'm playing on like the notion of my genes versus my genes. And so, you know, my genes are great because they're blue. We get it. We know what you're referring to. We see what you're saying. But I think it was the first time that I saw something as explicit as that in the sphere of marketing. Can you decode that advert for us? And also, you know, explain maybe how we've got to the point where advertisers are like, that's a great idea. Let's play on the idea of genes. When I saw that ad, it was just one of those what moments. It's like, did she say that? You have to rewind the tape. You have to go back and say, did she say that? And what is patently clear is, first of all, the plausible deniability built into that ad, because if you look at how that script works, she says, my genes are blue. Now, depending on who you are, you can read that in a particular way, right? You could, if you were being generous, read it and say that that last line completely negates everything that happened before. And if you had an actor in that advert that didn't conform to how Sydney Sweeney is racialized, that advert reads in a very different way. So what is very clear with that plausible deniability built into that advert and with the social media kerfuffle that has resulted is that advertising agencies know very well how to make money. They know adverts on their own don't make money, but they know that controversy around adverts make money. And yeah, they hit this one out the park, I think. So yeah, the dog whistling is there, but I think it's important to point out the dog whistling is there on both sides, because they knew that what they had set up is this very perfect storm that's going to happen on TikTok, it's going to happen on Instagram, and it's going to sell more genes. Right. Controversy sells.
Sex sells in the first instance, so that's pretty obvious. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think I've heard some pushback, which is, you know, American Eagle is a company that's founded by two Jewish brothers. They would never do this. I feel that it is disingenuous to suggest that there wasn't a huge amount of thought that went into how this program was done.
Shocking. And I suppose, you know, for many of us, like one of the first big stories that put eugenics back in the center of culture and public discourse in a way that was, you know, maybe more accessible to your average person. I want to just ask about the science bit about eugenics, because my understanding is that the whole idea that, you know, you can improve the human race was based on these guys looking at animals. Like they were like fans of race horses, and they were like, oh, if you breed this horse and this horse, you get like a super horse. So why can't we just do that with humans, right? And so I want to ask you firstly about, you know, the science itself and how it is that if it was not verifiable, if it was not science that could be empirically, demonstrably verified according to the empirical methods that we use, then what was the function of eugenics?
Well, I think the important thing to remember in that instance is that when the idea comes up versus when it is disproved, there's about 100 years worth of science that has to happen in that interim. So when Francis Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883, he wanted to come up with a word to describe his vision for a state that's run on scientific evidence. So a lot of people will say that by eugenics he meant well-born. He takes a Greek word, eugenis, meaning well-born. But the X is an important part here too, right? The X is what makes it science, physics, statistics, economics, right? And so what Galton was trying to achieve was, if we measure carefully enough, we can come up with ways in which to guarantee the traits that we like, which he, as an ethno-nationalist, Anglo-Saxon supremacist person who was very interested in making sure that the foundations of the British Empire were sound. And for him, that meant that the foundations of the British race also had to be sound. This was his mission. It was the thing that he was trying to do. And yes, it's based on his cousin Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, one of the most important scientific ideas of the world, not just Western science, but altogether. And yeah, Darwin, in the first chapter of On the Origin, Darwin talks about all these different animals that humans have bred for our own benefit. So yeah, the racehorses race faster. Pigeons, he was very interested in. Barnacles, he's very interested in. Charles Darwin's politics are very different from Francis Galton's. He's anti-slavery. A lot of people think that Darwin, held on to that theory and that idea for a long time because he was a Christian and he didn't want to kill God. But actually, Darwin's work was controversial in scientific circles at the time, because Darwin is what's called a monogenist. He believes in the common descent of all human beings. The title of his book, On the Origin of Species, is because he's trying to answer a very specific question. What makes a species? And he's operating in a time when people are making the argument that non-white people are different species from white people, and therefore their subjugation under colonialism, chattel slavery, all of the hideousnesses that are being done under these people is okay because they're not actually people. That's what he was fighting against.
But wasn't his theory also used to justify that there were people at different levels on the evolutionary scale, and somehow black people, even though we all originate as black people, were somehow not? Yeah,
I'm not making an apology for Darwin in this situation. He's still very racist in the things that he says and the things that he believes. He's just coming to it from there's a different angle, and it's important to appreciate that difference. And so when Galton comes to this scenario, what he did was he went along with the movement that then becomes social Darwinism in his aftermath, because he was very happy to accept Herbert Spencer, the economist's interpretation. That's where we get survival of the fittest from.
Right, which is also back in vogue, right? And we'll talk about the ways in which the new tech bros are really thrilled about this idea that there's, a scientific theory that justifies why some people are just going to get left behind and probably die. But it's okay. It's natural, right, Subhadra?
Unfortunately. So, Darwin is like, it's really sad that the New Zealanders are going to die out. It's really sad that this is going to happen. Unfortunately, not a new argument.
Well, and let's talk about it in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza right now, because one of the big things that these eugenics theories, this race-based science, was used to justify was the annihilation of entire peoples. Absolutely. You talked about forced sterilization. Do you see any parallels between the resurgence of these eugenics-based ideas and the ongoing genocide in Gaza?
I'm sad to say that I do. There's a reason why those of us who called it a genocide 2 years ago were able to call it that early, is because those of us who study this subject know what a genocide looks like. And so there are two strands to this. One is the actual wiping out of people. So the very systematic bombardment of Gaza, so killing people in large numbers where they stand, is very obvious. The killing of people is genocide. I don't think that is a controversial thing to say. In the scenario that the people being targeted by the Israeli government are a very specific group of people. So that's not a difficult argument to make. It's one that South Africa took to the International Court of Human Rights. That is one strand of it. But there's another strand to it as well. And that's very obvious to me from where I sit historically and politically, because what I'm seeing is the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, the fact that they are called savage, animals. This rhetoric, by the way, also 100 years old. So dating back to the Nakba and previously, this language that Palestinians are somehow not human is being reiterated again. And it's also being reiterated through the media as well, in terms of, and we're very familiar with this discourse of how Palestinians are spoken about in headlines versus how Israelis are spoken about in the headline.
But what about, and I'd like you to get really specific if you could here, and the parallels with periods in history where these genocides aren't happening, just because people think they're inferior people. They're happening for political reasons. Yeah. The indigenous people, indigenous Americans were obviously being murdered en masse, not just because they were perceived to be inferior humans, but because numerically their political weight was likely to have an impact on the newly arrived European migrants to the US. Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of a parallel here with what's happening in Gaza? Is this what we're looking at?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the genocide of indigenous Americans in North America is actually probably the best parallel, because what we're looking at is a settler colony. We're looking at people who are coming in from Spain, from England, and then from other parts of Europe over the course of 18th and 19th centuries. And what the indigenous people of the US represented to them, in part, they've got this idea of the noble savage, but it is a political threat because these people are there and the land belongs to them. So in the chapter of my book where I talk about justice and the rule of law, the ways in which the American colonies, newly liberated American colonies, see the Cherokee Nation, for example, as a political threat is because the Cherokee were one of the so-called civilized tribes. They adopt Western ways of being. So they become farmers. Well, they had their own farming as well, but they establish themselves on the land as farmers. They have their own free press. They want to establish their own constitution so that what they are creating is an equal nation to sit alongside these new United States. And what President Andrew Jackson says is nothing doing. You are an uncivilized nation. There are aspects that cannot be changed, i.e. you're brown people, therefore you will always be savages. You can't pretend to be civilized even as much as you do. Cherokee also, by the way, were slave owners. That's how civilized they were. They enslaved black people. And so that is what then eventually culminates in 1838-39 in what we know as the Trail of Tears. 16,000 people lifted from their land that they had lived on for millennia, and moved to another part of North America. 16,000 people picked up and moved, 4,000 of them die along the way, and their descendants still live as second-class citizens in the United States. So the parallel with Gaza is a very obvious one, because what it is people coming in and saying, this land, we're not going to share it. This land is ours. The discourse is different. There wasn't so much of a religious aspect in terms of how the US system worked. It was more these philosophical ideas of manifest destiny, but white supremacy is built into it as well. And so therefore, when we see the dehumanization of Palestinian people, what we again see is the rhetoric of white supremacy at play in this scenario. The ways in which how some people are racialized as superior and others are racialized to the point where they're not even people anymore. So it's fine to wipe them off their land.
And so one of the aspects that always struck me was the ways in which that dehumanization linked to this idea of, eugenics-based hierarchies of race were allowing doctors, people who take an oath, to experiment and torture in many ways those that they deemed lesser, right? And back in Nazi Germany, of course, we heard about these horrific experiments on Jews, on the Roma, on the disabled people, in the name of medical research and progress. Now, today, Israel is facing similar allegations of harvesting organs from Palestinians. There are documented cases going back decades. Just recently, during the so-called ceasefire exchange, Gaza's health ministry received 190 bodies. Many showed signs of torture and many were also missing organs. What does this type of medical experimentation tell us about how science is being used to justify violence within this eugenic mindset?
Well, as far as I know, there has not been a claim that any of that work was done with science in mind. It reads just like torture. But let's look at it historically. The experimental work that was done in concentration camps really highlights the hypocrisy and the racism held by eugenicists, but also by race scientists altogether. The science and the experimentation that was done on people in Nazi Germany brings with it the same cognitive dissonance as the systematic rape of enslaved black women during chattel slavery in the US and in the Caribbean. And it goes to show that they know that they're lying, because they know that these must be people if you can have babies with them. And it is a very disingenuous, seems like a very weak word in the context, but it's still very deliberate in terms of how people were dehumanized, that women were systematically raped so that they would produce more black children to be enslaved, in the same way that if it were the case that these people weren't people, there really wouldn't be point in doing science on them, because what could they tell us about ourselves?
Was that the point, to learn about humans through experimenting on these people?
Yeah, this is biological. This is like, how do these aspects of bodies work? Pain thresholds and that kind of scenario. The horrendous experiments done on people to demonstrate what people can put up with.
Talking about bad science, we've seen headlines recently about the ways in which, Trump, and here apparently also Nigel Farage, who refused to reject the claim that was made by Donald Trump linking painkillers, notably paracetamol, taken during pregnancy, to autism in children. Yeah. So we're seeing this kind of resurgence of what might be called bad science. And I have to point out that, major scientific bodies like the NHS here in England claim there is no causal link between paracetamol in pregnancy and autism. But we now have this kind of trend of very powerful people in prominent positions, including in leading governments around the world, making claims based on, I'm going to use the word bad science. As somebody who has studied the ways in which bad science is weaponized, what do you observe about this trend? Why is it happening? How can it be popularized in the way that it is when it's patently false? And if it is patently false, what is its function?
Its function is the dehumanization of autistic people. It's certainly the case that the arguments that are being presented, i.e. the false argument that Tylenol causes autism. First of all, I don't think anywhere in how that message was put across were there data tables, were there statistics, were there published papers to be able to demonstrate this. It was simply an announcement made from a podium. Right. So it's got the cloak of science on, but it's not even pretending to be science. They're not even bothering to falsify any evidence to be able to make this argument. So what it is doing is it's problematizing a minoritized group of people. It is saying our society is sick and these are the people that are making it sick. And they are the threat, and what we need to do is to control them. The science around autism has changed a lot in the last century. We've gone from theories around that were purely environmental and sexist. There was this idea of the refrigerator mother, and an idea that a woman wasn't affectionate enough to the child was what caused autism. Have you heard about this?
I have.
Yeah, okay. So that has been debunked. And we've now moved on to an area where we're looking at the very complex aspects of the genetics of autism. And this is by no means well-established science either, that we're still investigating how this can work. The thing that has remained the same throughout is the fact that autistic people are never going to fit into our society. This is the attitude that we have, is that people who are neurodiverse, there's something wrong with them. And this is the same kind of discourse when it comes to racialization. There's something wrong with those people who look like that, be it Jews in Nazi Germany, be it black people in the US, be it Muslim people in the UK. So it's always about picking out a group of people who are seen to be a problem. In any kind of fascist government, you have to demonstrate your strength. So they're demonstrating their strength in terms of investigating this, and also then saying that we're going to take steps to make sure that this isn't a problem anymore. They did it with immigrants in the US, and now they're doing it with neurodiverse people. They've done it with trans people in the US as well, and unfortunately we're doing it here with trans people too.
But the problem that you have with this discussion surely is that almost a quarter of US adults believe that vaccines cause autism. That's a view that's now shared by the US Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy.
Yes.
In April, Kennedy decried the increasing prevalence of autism in the US as something that, quote unquote, destroys families. And he added that children who, quote unquote, regressed into autism will, and this was interesting, the statement, never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job. And then he went on to the kind of remembering that maybe he needed to sugarcoat this a bit more with they'll never play baseball, they'll never go on a date, etc. Is this a genuine concern with people who have autism?
Clearly not. It is, again, taking on the cloak of concern. And as you say, the way that he framed that changed halfway through how he was talking about it. Why do we think autistic people are a problem? Why do we think black people are a problem? Why do we think Muslims are a problem? We think they're a problem because of the way our society is set up, and it was inherent in the language of that critique there. They'll never pay taxes. Billionaires don't seem to pay taxes either. We don't seem to think that they're a problem in the way that we really should. Yeah, it's very interesting where the focus and where the spotlight on who the people who are a problem are. And this is very much in the frame of eugenic thinking. Because eugenic thinking was Francis Galton essentially rebranding race science for the 20th century. So it's bigger than we think it is, but also it never went away. What's really interesting about how we can quote the numbers of 1 in 4 people in the US think that vaccines cause autism is because folks in the US exist within their own circles. These theories are ones that they are steeped in as well. Bad race science and just race science in general. Angela Saini talks about this in her brilliant book, Superior, the subtitle of which is The Return of Race Science, but the argument that she makes there is it never went away. So the scientists who refused to sign the 1951 UNESCO Accord on Race, which was the world coming together to say, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and in the aftermath of what the Nazis did in Germany, we don't hold on to these ideas about race as scientists anymore. But not everyone agreed with it. And so they've been carrying on doing what they have been doing over the course of the last decades. And it resurfaces in things like the bell curve. It resurfaces in...
The bell curve?
The Bell Curve is a book that was published in 1994, co-authored by Charles Murray and Richard Herrenstein, which was a book that purported that black people were less intelligent than white people based on IQ testing.
And this is a book published in the 1990s?
Yes.
So let me just ask you this. So it's not just that they are seeing autistic people as a problem to be solved, but there's also now the creation of this database. I don't know if you've heard about this. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said he wants to create a national database of autistic people, supposedly to find the root cause of autism, which he's even called a preventable disease. Should we be alarmed at the creation of a database of autistic people? And why? Because, of course, he'll say that it's just so we can study autism better to prevent it.
We should be concerned when any minoritized group of people are targeted for this kind of level of, if we're going to be creating a database. Let's, again, rewind the tape and think about how BMI, for example, was promulgated into national databases.
BMI?
The body mass index. Going a long way back, once upon a time, there was a Belgian statistician called Aldaf Ketele who measured people's bodies and was interested in how physical manifestations relate to other aspects of humanity, really. He's very interested in what the average man looks like physically, but also mentally and in terms of their personality capability. Fast forward into the 20th century, Ansel Keys, who is a nutritionist, does lots of really quite horrible experiments on people in terms of starvation, actually, but is very interested in understanding the connections between weight and height. And so he came up with this body mass index that is a connection between weight and height. It only really works if you're a white man. It doesn't really work if you're too tall or too short, or if you are too thin, or if you are too big. The body mass index is a scale on which people's bodies are rated, and it can determine your access to medication in this country and also in the US. The reason I'm telling you this whole story is because the body mass index then really fed into how insurance policies worked in the US. So it's not a database, but it's certainly people's physical details being captured in a database format that then goes on to see how they get access to healthcare in the US system.
What about this notion of registries? Are there any historical precedents that you think we should be attentive to when we talk about, creating a national database of autistic people?
We absolutely should, and unfortunately Nazi Germany is the position again. So the fact that Jewish people particularly were made to register made that they were easy to trace and they were very easy to find and then put on trains and put into concentration camps. Whenever they come for any minoritized group of people, we need to be concerned about how that data is going to be used. Margaret Atwood in A Handmaid's Tale talks about the ways in which women were completely disenfranchised because they ticked that gender box, and that meant that their bank accounts could be seized. So when they come for any minoritized group of people, we should all be concerned because first of all, we should be concerned for them And at the very least, we know that we potentially could be next.
Let me ask you about COVID and whether you feel that COVID was a moment in which there was a normalization of eugenics language across society. You know, I remember our then Prime Minister Boris Johnson essentially saying, you know, let the disease run through.
We'll take it on the chin.
Right, we'll take it on the chin. Oh, well, older people will not take it on the chin. They'll literally die. But that's okay. That's sort of normal. That's sort of what was bound to happen anyway. And I think there was a lot of language that seemed to suggest that there were some people in our society who were dispensable because economically the price we were going to pay for protecting them was too high.
Absolutely.
So to what extent was COVID a bit of a watershed moment when it comes to the return of eugenics ideas in the public sphere? If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio.
Always bearing in mind that they never went away. But yeah, COVID was definitely sort of a touch point for me sitting at home in lockdown, generally avoiding the news because it was horrible. But paying really close attention to these headlines and this discourse. So, and it changed almost immediately. But for those of us who can remember back and the evidence is there, yeah, Boris Johnson saying take it on the chin is Boris Johnson listening to Dominic Cummings, who made it very clear in his blogs that he believes in an idea of how the state can better control its population. What he has said on blogs that he has published is that he is behind ideas to do with intellectual superiority. There was a controversy, this was just pre-COVID actually, in 2019 when he hired a guy called Andrew Sabinsky, who has also made blatant statements about eugenics. As part, he was one of these super forecasters that Dominic Cummings was wanting to bring on board. Cummings is part of a long line in this country of people who have ideas about the heritability of intelligence, and really believes that, you know, this is the way in which the country needs to move forward, is to make sure that those people deemed the most intelligent should have the greatest access to, you know, well, to existing.
But how does that translate in policy, though, Subhadra? Like, these are like wild ideas. Like, yeah. But where are you seeing this manifest?
So the idea that at the beginning of how Johnson wanted to approach COVID was the take it on the chin, let it run through the policy. There were discussions of herd immunity. So herd immunity is a phrase that's used in medicine, and it's used when there's a vaccine. So what happens when you vaccinate a population is that the herd becomes immune, because the vaccination is one way of protecting the herd against a disease. There wasn't a vaccine for COVID at the time, and so ideas to do with herd immunity were the people who are strong enough to resist this disease are going to survive, and the people who are not strong enough will die.
But isn't that but that's the foundation of the beliefs in our society, the survival of the fittest? It's literally Darwinian. Yeah. Isn't that what we believe? Isn't that what we're taught in science? What's the issue?
It isn't what we're taught in science. There are plenty of scientists and plenty of geneticists who are not eugenicists. And there were people at the time that were making it very clear that that was not the appropriate way to deal with a pandemic and with this particular virus in this situation. But the discourse was still there, and the discourse continues to this day in the number of people who say things like, oh, well, we probably shouldn't have locked down for as long as we should, or the economic cost was too great. And so, yeah, the world that we live in nowadays is perfectly happy to put capitalist profit ahead of people's lives. I just don't think that that's the right way to run a society.
The popularization of eugenics-based ideas seems to occur simultaneously with periods of economic crises, right? It's like, you know, suddenly there's not enough money going around, so let's find the people that are kind of dispensable. Mm-hmm. Do you see any connection between the current economic crisis that we're going through and the resurgence of these ideas in popular culture at the very least?
Yes, absolutely. I hope most historians would agree with this, which is that if we're looking at the history of the past 100 years or so, what we've essentially done is we've rewound the tape on the 20th century and we're running it again. So financial crisis it happening at the beginning of the century, global pandemic happened around about the exact same time, and now the slip slide into fascism is played on fast forward. So you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, there is the inherent belief in society, this rampant individualism, based on an idea of capitalism, is that, if you have to be able to survive on your own, and if you have to depend on the state for anything, then you immediately become a drain on the resources, despite the fact that that is what the state is for. And so what we can see is demonization of certain groups of people. And here's the interesting and important point. When Francis Galton rebrands race science into eugenics in the 20th century, he makes race a broad church. And so it's not simply about race, it's about disability, it's about gender, it's about class, and it's about body size. And these are all aspects of parts of conversation that we are having now in terms of so-called identity politics. And it is unsurprising because it is all of these aspects on which people who are minoritized on these bases of their identity experience social injustice in our society. And so is it a surprise that we see it now? Absolutely not. But you make a very important point, which is that it's still there in times of plenty. We just don't worry about it so much. Because of this Darwinian concern, so-called Darwinian concern, it's actually a Malthusian concern about the fact that resources are limited, which is an interesting argument. Because remember, there's those billionaires, they've got plenty of resources. And the fact that there's not enough for all of us, and therefore we have to make decisions about who gets things and who doesn't.
And we've also gone through this really weird period where I'm old enough to remember the idea that, we were in a crisis of overpopulation, and Bill Gates was obsessed with African women having less kids. And suddenly, bloop, we switched to, no, there's actually an underpopulation crisis. Like, didn't you know? It's not overpopulation. There's not enough of certain types of people in the world.
Let us not be under misapprehension that those two positions are not contradictory.
Explain to me how they're not contradictory, because this is wild to me. How can we have overpopulation and underpopulation? Oh, unless we're not talking about the same population.
And so the concern about too many people, not enough resources on the planet, is an old one. The idea that not enough white people is also an old one. So it's the same argument, it's just being repackaged in different ways.
So how much of this argument is actually about population size? Because I think this is where it gets really confusing. It's like, are we going through an overpopulation or an underpopulation crisis? Right, in the UK, we know that birth rates are declining. We keep being told that we're not having enough children here in this country, and that, that's why there needs to be immigration to, prop up our pensions, because otherwise we're going to die old and alone and without any money, which is likely to occur anyway. And then, of course, on the other side, the projections are that sub-Saharan Africa's population will nearly double to more than 2 billion by the mid-century. It's growing faster than the global average, and by 2070, it'll become the most populous place globally, surpassing Asia. So how much of the conversation that we have about overpopulation, underpopulation is actually about population size?
Well, I mean, let's just flip the conversation then and see how it plays. Let's just suggest that, at this point in time, there is an excess of white people in the world. If I were to make that argument, I don't think it would fly in the way that the reverse argument does. And so it just goes to show again how inherent our assumptions are and how dehumanized non-white people in the world are altogether. Sometimes it's really actually useful to look at the data in this situation. There was a brilliant statistician called Hans Rosling who looked at the ways in which wealth distribution works in the world. And he made the point, yes, there's a billion people in Africa, but it's extremely racist of us to assume that every African nation is the same as the other. We can't look at South Africa or Nigeria and assume that they are the same as other nations on the same continent. And the other thing that Rosling pointed out, by the way, is that economic balance and economic growth for a nation can rest on two very important points. Both of them are to do with women. One of them is women's education, and one of them is free and easy access to birth control. If you establish those two things in your country, your GDP goes up.
Yes, we've been hearing this
regardless
a lot.
of what happens to your population.
So it is or it isn't about population size?
No, so the arguments about people concerned about overpopulation are people who are racist, and they're just trying to suggest that we blame African nations, Asian nations for things like the climate crisis, when it's very clear that the climate crisis is a result of it's a result of the age of empire and the 20th century and extractive capitalism, and just burn, burn, burn without any thought as to what's going to happen in the long term.
So are you saying that the entire conversation over overpopulation, which is surely what Bill Gates has made his post-Microsoft career all about, is actually a racist ideal based in eugenics?
The discourse is eugenic thinking. And if your immediate instinct on being told that there are too many people on the planet and that is an environmental risk is to go to control the population of black and brown people all over the world, that's inherently racist.
Speaking of inherently racist, in October last year, Donald Trump said there were, quote unquote, a lot of bad genes in the US when discussing murders allegedly committed by immigrants living in the US. Here in the UK, we've seen a huge focus on Pakistani grooming gangs, even though sexual violence is not exclusive to any ethnic group.
And most sex offenders in the UK are white.
Right. And
as reflects the population, unsurprisingly.
We're seeing this increasing racialization of crime.
Increasing?
You don't think it's increasing?
Gang violence particularly. Carla has made this point until he is blue in the face, which is that the way in which we think about black gangs in London versus gangs in Glasgow, all the same problems caused by the same socioeconomic deprivation. But the solution for some reason is to do with race when it comes to black people versus when it comes to white people. So the discourse around criminality in this country has always been racialized. That's not a new thing. It's just picking on different groups of people. So yes, definitely, like Muslims and South Asian Muslims, particularly in the case of what happened with the Rochdale grooming gangs, which, by the way, I'm not saying that isn't a problem. I'm South Asian myself. I understand how patriarchy and misogyny works in South Asian society. I'm not saying that we are perfect. I'm just saying that numerically, maybe you want to look elsewhere for your problems.
But so how do you explain this? Because I'm using the word resurgence of this focus on race only in as much as it seemed to me before that there were always people who said it, but there was also like a big pushback against it, right?
And there still is a big pushback against it.
So my impression...
Well, possibly not by politicians, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think this is where the tension lies for me when I see mainstream political discourse today and even mainstream media discourse, It seems to me that people who are pushing back against this racialization of criminality are on the back foot, are increasingly the minority.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying to you, how have we got here? How is it that is now perceived as something that is casually discussed in terms of race?
It is certainly true that in the mainstream, what used to be the silent part is now being spoken out loud. And the way that we got here is the here that we've always been. And potentially some bits of progress from late 90s, early 2000s is only simply being kind of rolled back. The rhetoric that I am seeing and feeling as a non-white person living in the UK, certainly last summer, is the same thing that my parents dealt with in the 1970s and 60s and 70s when they lived here.
You're talking about the so-called race riots last summer, which targeted black and brown people across the UK.
Yeah. And that is scary. And it is concerning. And also the fact that there are political parties like Reform UK who really do seem to be speaking to these concerns from people. But the discourse has always been racialized because otherwise this wouldn't be so easy to do. There have always been the painting of non-white people as a criminal element. And what's really interesting, of course, is like if we look at it historically, the same thing was done to Eastern Europeans up until Brexit. They can't use Brexit as an excuse anymore. But it was the same thing. It was like Albanian gangs, and it was, that kind of thing. It's like all of these people coming in seem to be a threat. But this isn't new. Carl Pearson, who was Galton's disciple and the first professor of eugenics at UCL, was doing studies on Jewish children, so the children of Jewish immigrants to the UK. And what he was saying was it's very clear that the environment isn't having an effect on these children, that these things are racially inherent, and the only way to protect the British race is to stop them coming in. That discourse hasn't changed in 100 years. In my book, in the chapter about nationality and the idea of the nation, I outline the history of how immigration rules in this country have always been racist. When they heard that the Windrush was coming, they tried to redirect it somewhere else. And then they went straight back to the law books to make sure that they could limit the number of British people, i.e. people from the British Empire, coming back to the motherland.
So I hear you on the idea that there's huge continuity, but is there anything new about this current juncture and about the way this is being wielded now?
What's new to me is just the sheer volume and the sheer amount of sludge out there in terms of these poor arguments, and also the various people that it's being directed at. So with COVID, that we understood disabled people to be expendable. In the so-called trans debate, trans people are being targeted, and black and brown people as per. We're going through the same arguments that have been happening all this time. I think the thing that is different is just simply how difficult it is to make an argument against it. Right? This is our work is really, really difficult right now because there's just such a sheer volume of nonsense. And, there's the old phrase, like a lie can go around the world in the time it takes the truth to tie its shoelaces. There is so many actors in so much bad faith promulgating so much bad information through social media. They know how to work these things. That those of us who are like, can we come back to what reality is? Can we remember our common humanity? Can we actually remember where the money is in this situation and where we can go to solve some of our economic problems? We're just drowned out.
So we're drowned out, and it feels like facts no longer matter in this conversation. We've discussed eugenics in terms of obviously the scientific community and how it's now being expressed in the political sphere. I want to talk to you about something called economic eugenics. I think I've heard you talk about the kind of the 2-child cap on benefits here in the UK as sort of a form of economic eugenics. So can you tell me a little bit about that idea?
So eugenics doesn't simply work in terms of sterilizing people. That is very overt version of it. But there are covert versions of it, and there are more subtle and nuanced versions of it as well. And yeah, the 2-child cap is a very obvious one, and also particularly harsh that the incoming Labour government made a point of not overturning that when it said that it was speaking for working people, when it was demonstrated that 250,000 children in this country would be lifted out of poverty if the 2-child cap were removed. Michael Marmot, who basically has said that it is a kind of eugenics to suggest that people who have more than 2 children will not be given money to support after that second child, except in the case of rape, which I think is a very interesting thing, because it shows that the conversation around it is still one of kind of like moral culpability. Like, you need to be responsible. You shouldn't be having children if you can't afford them.
So why is this a form of eugenics to suggest that, people who are on benefits relying on the state shouldn't have more than 2 children, because that's what the state is offering to pay for?
If it were the case that deterring people on the basis of monetary incentive worked to stop people having children, then I'd be all for it, right? But what we're talking about here is real children. Okay, we're not talking about some sort of imagined children. These are not our imagined grandchildren that we're leaving the world to, right? These are actual children. These are real people in real circumstances who are being denied support from the state and are living in poverty as a result.
And what's the connection to eugenics?
The connection to eugenics is this is a highly classed conversation. Again, so the eugenic bit is how we conceive of people, forgive the pun, of who have children who can't afford them, right? Is that they're not clever enough, right? That they're not doing their social duty, that they are a drain on resources. So that's the eugenic thinking that frames what is a very classed conversation.
And it's interesting that that's also come off the back of years of depicting the working class as, chavs. We had TV series depicting them as sort of feckless and lazy. And what about the connection between the rollback of reproductive rights and eugenics? Do you see any connection between the assault on reproductive rights in the US, which is also now, being taken up by people like Farage, who seem to think that this is quite a good idea, and eugenics? Is there a connection there as well?
It's a very straightforward one, because, again, one of the more covert manifestations of eugenics is impinging on people's reproductive freedom. I want a little bit of history again. So in the UK, we kind of pride ourselves that we didn't do the sterilization thing. We might be aware of the fact that eugenics happened in the US, and it happened in the form of involuntary sterilization. In the UK, there was a law on the books, the 1930 Mental Deficiency Act, which at the last minute didn't have sterilization put in. Winston Churchill wanted it in, but he was overruled. But the law on the books for the Mental Deficiency Act meant that people could be picked up off the streets and put into so-called colonies, asylums, because they were seen as a threat to the general population because they would breed out of control. These are mostly people with, these are people with either physical or intellectual learning disabilities. And they were separated on the basis of sex. So we didn't sterilize them, but we locked them up. So just to point out that the UK doesn't need to worry about taking the moral high ground, we were doing exactly the same thing. We didn't cut them open, we locked them up. I make this point because I think there is a certain complacency in the UK, and particularly around the discourse with trans people, which is that, we don't need to worry about what's happening in the States. And actually, the good news is in this country that moving toward the decriminalization of abortion is a really, really positive step, right? This is a good thing to have happened. Because unfortunately, in the US, with the Dobbs decision and the overturn of Roe versus Wade, there are people in the US now who cannot get safe access to an abortion in the way that they used to be able to. And that is an infringement on their reproductive rights. In the US, the eugenics connection, because it's counterintuitive, right? Because you would think that people having reproductive freedom would help with racial control in a certain way.
So this is the idea, right? So I was listening to a podcast that was talking about Planned Parenthood actually being started by somebody who supported eugenics ideas. Now, of course, today Planned Parenthood is a system that operates in a way that it offers, contraceptive support to women who need it. But that link was a little shocking to me.
Yes, unsurprising. Although I'm sorry to say, basically go back 100 years and every progressive person you want to think about probably was a eugenicist. Eugenics knows no politics. It was on the left and the right 100 years ago. Unfortunately, it continues to do that nowadays as well. It's just very much more overtly on the right at the moment. So the Dobbs decision is essentially informed by this idea of not enough white people. So if you stop giving poor white people access to abortion, there's going to be more white babies. Now, again, in terms of complacency, we need to remember that the Supreme Court in the UK has made the decision that the definition of woman is a biological one. This is stemming from a lot of things happening in the zeitgeist around the so-called trans debate. And I would point people to a brilliant book called Bodies Under Siege by a journalist called Sian Norris. And what she's done is she's gone and she's looked at the lobbying and she's looked at the organizations in the US who are anti-women's rights and therefore anti-reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. They're also anti-gay marriage. They are anti all of the good, fun progress that we had. They are anti-will and grace. This is what the scenario is. And she has studied about how they have brought their arguments and their money over to Europe and are present and interfering with elections. So the trans debate seems like it almost came out of nowhere, and it did. It's because what these folks did, and there's a researcher called Neil Dutta who's based in Europe, and he's looked at how they very cannily mobilized a highly niche academic debate about what it amongst feminists to do with trans women, and they have used it as a wedge issue to break us apart. And they've done it superbly successfully. You can't even put a jeans advert on the telly without everyone shouting at each other. And so this is how it all comes in. But eugenics is the frame of how these political discussions are happening now, which is why we need more than ever solidarity and unity amongst everyone, because without that, we're going to be in big trouble.
And presumably also learn to identify where eugenics-based thinking is kind of popping up within our culture.
Absolutely.
And so I want to ask you about the wellness industry, which to me feels heavily coded with eugenics-based ideas. These ideas of biohacking, this idea that you can enhance your performance, you can achieve peak age, live to 150. I think there was that off-mic moment between Putin and the Chinese PM where Putin says to him something along the lines of, you can basically live to 150 as long as you change your organs. Cash, change your organs. Are you aware of eugenics-based ideas infiltrating this space? And can you give us some idea of how that is apparent to you? Are you seeing things in, reels, in, ads for the wellness industry that you're looking at and thinking, oh my God, this is literally eugenics?
So with the advent of things like Skinny Talk, The heroin chic is back again, and we all know that the fashion goes through phases. But it's hugely apparent in terms of the wellness industry, in terms of all of the white women yoga, in terms of the just don't eat kind of thing. So the place where it's most obvious is what's broadly called fat phobia, but I would also highlight is anti-fatness in our society. And again, the same discourse that we hear around immigrants being a drain on resources, too many of them, too much, is the same argument that we hear against fat people in our society, who, by the way, have been here all the time. The idea is conflating body size and health, BMI. The fact that these are coming to the fore now. And of course, GLP-1s, and the proliferation of things like Ozempic and Mounjaro. So the fact that you can be prescribed your skinny pill now, again, it's this rampant individual. If you choose not to take that pill, it's very much you being the problem, isn't it?
And so is the idea here that the eugenics ideas are internalized by people within these industries, and they're unconsciously reproducing them? Absolutely. Or how does it work?
Yeah, because this is the social soup in which we are all steeped. We are steeped in ideas to do with how we are racialized, what our bodies look like, because we're still steeped in race. Remember, eugenics is race science rebranded for the 20th century, and race science was always about the way that you look is the way that you are. And so the fact that race scientists and white supremacists correlate particular kinds of appearance with racial supremacy and intelligence, we should be unsurprised at the fact that, yes, again, really what's happening is that Palestinian people are being dehumanized to the point of extinction, and that black people are already so dehumanized that, for example, we don't talk about genocide in Sudan and Congo in the same way that we talk about it in Palestine. This isn't me trying to get on some kind of oppression Olympics, but it's just the discourse is inherent, and it shows how we value people. And the inherent message of all of this wellness discourse on social media is there are particular kinds of bodies that we endorse, and if you don't conform, then you're the problem.
Increasingly, rich people can also choose those bodies, right? We've also seen, this large number of tech bros now investing in these Silicon Valley startups to support something called polygenics. The founder of OpenAI, Sam Altman, has reportedly invested into a startup called Genomic Prediction. And Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, he and of course Palantir led a $110 million US investment in the gene engineering startup Synthego. So why are all the tech bros investing in tech-funded genetic innovation?
It's kind of a great example of how having a lot of money doesn't necessarily make you very clever. Do we all want to live forever? Sure, why not? Although the vast majority of people who live outside the West understand that it's very good to keep death close at hand, because then you remember other people's humanity. What is very clear is the fact that they choose to put their money into developments to do with making them and people like them, and even then I'm not even talking about all white people, they just mean other really rich dudes, live longer, when they could be putting their money into medical research to look into the genetic treatment for conditions like sickle cell anemia, for example. This is just very clear where their priorities lie.
Let's talk about transhumanism to make it more concrete. Sure. Peter Thiel has spoken about his belief in transhumanism, the idea that the peak of human evolution will be the merger of the machine, and anyone who opposes these tech developments is basically the Antichrist. We've spoken about Darwin. We've spoken about kind of the ways in which the idea of, the survival of the fittest is, deeply ingrained in our culture and being weaponized in different ways. But we're seeing this new movement, aren't we, among the tech bros, sure, who do believe in these ideas, but they're taking it into the 21st century through this fusion with the tech. The next step of human evolution is the merger of man and the machine. Do you see any connections between these transhumanism ideas and the ideas that are behind eugenics?
Yeah. Again, let's flip it, okay? And let's think about the people that they are not talking about. Or any and all of this investment going into transhumanism, if it's only going to be about making things better for a select group of people, that's inherently eugenics. If we're not talking about hearing aids for all, if we're not talking about, advancing technologies for wheelchair users, or looking at putting money into thinking about architecture in the built environment that makes these spaces more accessible, if we're not thinking about aging, which I think is a really interesting one, if you're going to live forever, how old do you want to be? If we're not thinking about the fact that aging makes us all disabled at some point in time, this is why it's eugenics with those guys. It's because they're only in it for themselves. They're not looking to the rest of us.
I think if you look at our popular culture, if you look at our legacy media spaces, the idea that these guys are the most sophisticated thinkers, the most advanced intellectuals, that actually their ideas are progress, is absolutely unquestioned. There may be a few people who might say, oh, they're a little bit of an oddity, 14 kids with these different women, and he seems to have some weird ideas about genes. But, by and large, Tesla, X, okay, he's a little out there, but these are the progressives of our world. And they are now literally embedded into our politics. They're literally embedded into the forms of policies that our leaders are devising for our world, because they're being led by this notion of progress that these people are pushing. Tech world seems to be in the grips of a kind of eugenicist revival with a twist. And I really want our audience to understand what that looks like. So if you could tell us how you're observing these eugenics-based ideas being, repackaged, remodeled, and resold to us with a little bit of a tech flex to them, what would you point us to?
The thing to understand is that they are able to tap into the understandings of everyday people in a way that ivory-towered intellectuals like me just can't, because eugenics slipped the bounds of science a long time ago. So what they are doing is that here's one place where they are very clever, is how they are able to mobilize the social discourse. And so it is then really imperative on those of us who are not aligned with them politically in all of the things. So those of us who are anti-racist, anti-ableist, who are feminists, to make our message as viscerally understandable as possible. The answer to this, by the way, is about tapping into our common humanity. They are very happy for us to forget how much we all have in common. And that is what is eugenics, because it's, again, building on race science, that science of difference, that science of hierarchy. Why are we so happy to believe that some people are better than others?
Let's take the example of IVF. They're doing these IVF screenings that are becoming more and more sophisticated. You can now choose not just gender, but eye color. And now there's even this competitive notion that you can pick the embryo with the least genetic deficiencies. There's also one claiming that they can spot the cleverest embryo.
Yeah, it's a complete nonsense, by the way.
So, but with that, they would say, yes, at the moment, the costs are huge. We're talking in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. But eventually that'll trickle down, and eventually it'll benefit everyone, and we'll be able to eliminate disease from the embryonic stage and make sure we only have humans who are the fittest and most able to deal with their environment. Isn't that a good thing, Subhadra?
No. Because the thing that they are talking about is eliminating certain types of people. Because if we let them determine what is fit, then they get to make that decision. And that means if you are neurodiverse, for example, if you are not racialized as white, for example, who gets to say what's desirable? It may be the case, and we've certainly seen this at play, just in the real world before we start to mess around with people's genes. People want their kids to go to private school because they know it conveys a social advantage. What is the social advantage? The social advantage exists within our very hierarchical society. Because if you go and get to hobnob with the posh people who are friends with the king, then you will have a social advantage. So obviously you will do everything to get to that point. If you are under the mistaken misapprehension that blue eyes and blonde hair is somehow the thing that makes you more intelligent than other people, then yeah, people are wanting to go to confer that advantage on their children. This is the reason why I keep going back to this whole nonsense about our society, is because if we flip our view of what our society is and who we should be taking care of, that is where we start to win. And it's unfortunate that we have to win in this scenario. I don't like this language of competition, because caring about other human beings shouldn't be a game, and it shouldn't be a competition. But if they have gamified our world, who put them in charge? And I think it's just, and it is amazing, and I still see it out in play. The fact that there are still monarchists in this country, you know, for some strange reason, we have held on to this belief that some people are more special than others.
And we're cheering them on. A lot of us on social media we're aspiring to be the billionaires. We're aspiring to be part of this tech bro class. We're aspiring to be, you know, close to the proverbial king, whatever incarnation that model takes today in your world. There's also this growing obsession online with the concept of long-termism. So this idea that it aims to sort of save humanity from extinction by making humans better, right? But it comes with a few caveats, one notable one being that the powerful white men like Musk and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos are positioned as the fittest to act on behalf of humanity. What would you say to critics who say that there is nothing more than, a cover for technocratic eugenics? You know, is this idea of the leadership by these very wealthy tech billionaires a reflection of the fact that they are, you know, the progressives of our time, you know, the luminaries of our era? Or is there something in their ideas themselves which are a reflection of this ongoing belief that we can weed out the lesser humans?
You've mentioned several different names, and they're each coming from a different point of view. The thing they have in common is the stupid money that they have. But if we look at Musk, for example, we know that within his family, these theories about the betterment of the human race is something that has been there for generations. I don't think Bill Gates is cut from that particular cloth. But what's very clear is that they are just as ignorant about this eugenic frame of thinking about the world as any of the rest of us are. So what's happening is that the people with all the money potentially think they are doing a good thing for humanity are tripping up on the same social injustices that are built into the system.
Such as?
The racism, the ableism, the sexism, the classism, and the anti-fatness.
But which they don't see as a problem.
No, because they haven't looked at it critically, and they didn't learn about eugenics when they were at school.
Or because they literally believe in this.
Unfortunately, so this is the other problem, and this is what historically the same mistake that race scientists have always made, is that they have looked at the world around us and they have mistook it as the result of a natural experiment and not a political situation.
That's a very powerful point. And it's particularly powerful because we are continuously being told that everything's so natural.
This is how they get you.
Yeah. And of course, we're being told not only that it's natural, but actually that the tech that's being developed can enhance what's natural. I think that's a really interesting one. So the tech billionaires are sort of creating a new kind of, I guess, could we call it like futuristic eugenics maybe?
What the thing to keep in mind is the eugenic frame. So they can call it what they want. If it's based on an idea of hierarchy and a racialized hierarchy or an ableist hierarchy, it's framed by eugenic thinking. We've seen this with AI as well. We've seen that the AI reproduces our racist assumptions about the world and our sexist assumptions about the world. So if this is the thing that they are programming their machine with, it's going to reproduce itself.
And so one of the points you made earlier that I thought was really interesting was that this idea of what we're seeing being the natural, you know, a product of sort of forces that are beyond our control is not entirely true, and that it's more so a product of political decisions. Now, in February, Elon Musk was interviewed on the Joe Rogan podcast, where he argued that Western civilization is weakened by empathy. And he claimed that some groups, undocumented migrants, white liberals, progressives, Democrats, and LGBTQ plus people, focus too much on their own needs rather than what is good for the collective survival of the many. And he called this civilizational suicide. What do you make of these ideas within a eugenic context?
Civilization. Western civilization is a racialized idea. And so when I write about it in my book, which coincidentally is called Uncivilized, 10 Lies That Made the West, what is very clear is that the language that Musk is using is, again, appropriating these very old ideas about white racial supremacy and white civilizational supremacy, picking up on even more historic ideas. We can go back 1,000 years where it was the so-called civilized Christian West against the Muslim East. Edward Said talks about Orientalism. This is the same old argument coming back again. These folks are particularly good at appropriating the language of the left, of the collective, and saying and appropriating it for their own ends. So, just interested to know how much of his money is he planning on sharing out, and when this transhumanism movement happens, how is he planning on distributing the wealth and the goods?
How do you respond to people who might say, okay, it's a bit harsh, some people are going to lose out, but ultimately we'll create a stronger, smarter civilization?
Here's the thing, how is it stronger or smarter?
Well, he would say you'll eliminate the people who are not as smart as they should be. You'll eliminate the people with diseases and defects that are a drain on society. These are literally the arguments being made.
Okay, again, as a historian, let's look at how this experiment was run previously. Again, let's rewind 1,000 years worth and look at European monarchy. It was never about who was clever, and it was never about who was better. It was always about who was richer. Unfortunately, a lot of people are seduced by the money or the lack of in their pocket, to realize that there are ways in which that they can have everything that they need without having to pursue this level of social advantage. I will concede that we live in an unequal world, and I can certainly understand that people would want to give their children particularly as much advantage as possible. I just don't think it's going to solve anything.
As somebody who studied the history of eugenics throughout your life, if there was one final thought you could leave us with in terms of the moment we find ourselves in, what you're observing in the world around us, the rise of these ideas, what should we be most attentive to?
The thing that we should be on our guard against are arguments against any group of minoritized people, regardless of how they're minoritized. It could be a racial argument, it could be a gender argument, it could be anything. Be mindful against any argument against a group of people made in that way, because, as history has shown us, by and large, the definition of that group gets wider, and eventually it'll get you.
Subhadra, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you see the value in what we do, please hit subscribe and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you prefer your episodes ad-free, join us on Patreon, where you'll also get exclusive drops and early access to what's next. Real talk like this doesn't happen without your support. So thank you for keeping this space fearless, independent, and unfiltered. See you next time for more tea. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.